right, so Genesis 15 today really gets to the heart of Abraham's journey. Picking up right where we left off, God has promised Abram land descendants, a blessing to all nations, even changes his name to Abraham, meaning father of many. But here in chapter 15, we see something really human happening, doubt.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? You'd think after such a grand promise, Abraham would be like jumping for joy. But instead, we see him grappling with the reality of a situation.
Okay, so let's break this down. Genesis 15 opens with God appearing to Abraham, reassuring him, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abraham's response is so relatable. He says, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?"
I mean, that's some serious doubt creeping in. It's not just doubt, though. It reveals a deep-seated fear. The fear of the promise remaining unfulfilled. He's looking at his life, his age, the societal norms where Eliezer, his servant, is next in line. And it just doesn't add up. It makes you wonder. What was going through Abraham's mind at that moment? Was he questioning God's power? Or maybe even his own worthiness to receive such a promise?
And it's not like he's shy about voicing these doubts either.
Yeah.
He lays it all out there before God. Really makes you realize that even the father of faith wrestled with uncertainty.
Exactly. And that's where I think this chapter becomes so powerful for us today. Because if Abraham, this giant of faith, could experience doubt, then it means our own struggles with doubt are not a sign of weakness. They're an opportunity for God to meet us, to deepen our understanding of his faithfulness.
So how does God respond to Abraham's very honest expression of doubt?
Well, he does what God does best. He goes bigger. He tells Abraham to look up at the stars and says, "So shall your offspring be." What a powerful image. It's like God is saying, Abraham, your human calculations can't even begin to comprehend the scale of what I'm going to do.
And that's where we stumble upon verse 6.
Yeah.
Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This verse is like a cornerstone in Christian theology, isn't it?
Absolutely. It speaks to the very core of our faith, righteousness by faith. We're not made right with God through our own efforts, our good deeds, or by perfectly understanding every theological concept. It's about trusting God, believing in his promises, even when we don't fully understand how they'll come to pass, just like Abraham did.
Okay, so we've got this incredible promise, this powerful affirmation of faith. But then Genesis 15 takes a rather strange turn with the covenant ceremony, right?
Yes. And this is where diving into the historical context can really deepen our understanding. This wasn't just some random ritual in the ancient Near East. Cutting animals in half and passing between the pieces was a common way to seal a covenant.
So it was a serious binding agreement, like saying, "May what happened to these animals happen to me if I break this oath."
Precisely. And the fact that God, represented by the smoking fire pot and blazing torch, passes between the pieces while Abraham sleeps, signifies a unilateral covenant. It's God saying, I'm committing to this regardless of whether Abraham messes up. This is on me.
Wow. So it's not just a promise. It's a sworn oath, a legally binding contract in a sense. God is putting his own divine reputation on the line. But hold on. What about the birds of prey that appear? They seem a bit out of place in this solemn ceremony.
That's where the symbolism gets really interesting. There are different interpretations, but some scholars see the birds as representing obstacles or evil influences trying to disrupt the covenant. Abraham driving them away could symbolize his role in protecting the promise, guarding the sacredness of what God is doing.
That adds a whole new layer of meaning to the scene. It's like Abraham, even in his doubt, is actively participating in protecting God's plan.
Exactly. And this sets the stage for the next part of this remarkable chapter, the prophecy.
The prophecy, where God tells Abraham that his descendants will be strangers in a foreign land for 400 years, facing hardship and slavery, but ultimately returning to inherit the land.
Yes, that one. And it's a prophecy packed with theological and historical significance. It not only foreshadows the Israelites' time in Egypt, but also raises profound questions about God's justice and timing. For example, God says, the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. What does that tell us about God's patience, his judgment, his interaction with human history?
That's a lot to unpack, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how this prophecy might have impacted Abraham emotionally. I mean, he's just been given this incredible promise, and now he's told his descendants will face centuries of suffering. It seems like a real test of faith.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that God's promises, while sure, don't always unfold in a straightforward, comfortable way. There's often a period of waiting, of struggle, even of darkness before the dawn breaks. And that brings us back to that pivotal verse, Genesis 15:6.
Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. It's like a refrain in this chapter, constantly reminding us that even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Even when the path ahead is unclear, faith is what matters.
It's about trusting that God's timing is perfect, that he's working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. And it's a faith that's credited to us, not earned by us.
That's a powerful thought. And it makes me wonder, if Abraham thousands of years ago could hold on to this faith, how can we in our own lives learn to trust God more deeply, even when his promises seem distant or the path ahead feels uncertain?
That's a great question, and I think exploring the rest of Genesis 15 will give us some valuable insights. But before we do, let's pause here and pick up the conversation in our next episode.
That's right, folks. We've only just scratched the surface of this incredibly rich chapter, so stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into the prophecy, the significance of those 10 ites, and what it all means for us today. And don't forget, you can find us on YouTube at www.youtube.com at Radio WBCM. For more deep dives, discussions, and even Christian music reviews. See you there.
Radio WBCM.
So picking up where we left off, the prophecy in Genesis 15 not only foreshadows a period of suffering for Abraham's descendants, but it also raises questions about the people who were already living in the land God promised.
Right. We can't just gloss over those 10 ites listed at the end of the chapter. The Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, and so on. It's a bit of a mouthful, but
Yeah.
they represent real people, real communities who were already established in Canaan.
Yeah, it's easy to read over those names quickly, but imagine being Abraham hearing that list. It almost feels like God is adding a caveat to his promise, like, here's this incredible land I'm giving you, but it's already occupied by these various groups.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what went through Abraham's mind at that moment. Did he think, wait, God, you just promised me this land, but now you're saying it belongs to all these other people?
Well, it highlights a tension we see throughout Scripture, the tension between God's promises and the reality of human history. God's promises are true, but they often unfold in ways we don't expect, over long periods of time, and involve challenges we might not foresee.
So it's not a simple, poof, here's your land kind of promise.
Yeah.
It's a promise that will be worked out over generations, a promise that requires faith and perseverance on the part of Abraham's descendants.
And it's important to remember that these ites weren't just random nomadic tribes. Many of them were powerful and well-established. The Hittites, for example, were known for their military strength and advanced culture.
So this wasn't going to be an easy inheritance. It was going to require struggle, conflict, and a lot of trust in God's timing and provision.
Exactly. And centuries later, when the Israelites entered the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership, we see this play out. The book of Joshua describes numerous battles and conquests as the Israelites fought to claim the land God had promised.
It's a reminder that faith doesn't always equal a comfortable, easy life. Sometimes it means facing challenges head-on, trusting that God is with us in the midst of the struggle.
And that brings us back to the core message of Genesis 15, righteousness by faith. Abraham didn't receive the land in his lifetime, but his faith in God's promise was credited to him as righteousness.
It's like he was saying, God, I trust you. Even if I don't see the fulfillment of this promise in my lifetime, I believe you're working behind the scenes, and my descendants will reap the benefits of your faithfulness.
It's a powerful example for us, isn't it? We might not always see the immediate results of our faith, but we can trust that God is working all things together for our good, and that he keeps his promises, even if it takes generations.
So what about those battles and conquests? It's a part of the story that can be hard to reconcile with our understanding of God as a God of love and mercy.
It's important to acknowledge that the conquest of Canaan, as described in the book of Joshua, was a violent and complex event. It's something we can't easily explain or justify from a modern perspective.
Right? We have to remember that we're reading an ancient text,
Right.
written in a specific historical and cultural context.
Exactly. But even within that context, it's important to approach these passages with humility and a willingness to grapple with difficult questions. The Bible doesn't shy away from portraying the complexities of human history, even the difficult parts.
And it's important to remember that God is ultimately a God of justice and mercy. He doesn't delight in violence or destruction.
Right. There are different ways to understand these events theologically. Some scholars point to the wickedness of the Canaanite nations at that time, their idolatry and practices that went against God's moral laws. God's judgment in this view was a response to their persistent rebellion.
But doesn't that raise the question of collective punishment? I mean, were there innocent people living in those nations who also suffered?
That's a valid point. And it's a question theologians have grappled with for centuries. There are no easy answers. But it's crucial to remember that God is also a God of grace and redemption. He always provides a way for people to turn from their wicked ways and find forgiveness.
So even in the midst of judgment, there's always the possibility of repentance and restoration.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think it's important to remember that God's purpose wasn't just about conquering a land, but about establishing a people who would be a blessing to all nations. The Israelites were called to be a light to the world, reflecting God's love and justice to all people.
So the conquest of Canaan was a step in a much larger story, a story that ultimately points to the redemption of all humanity through Jesus Christ.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it reminds us that God's plans are always bigger than we can imagine. They span generations, cultures, and ultimately point toward a future where all things are made new.
So we've explored Abraham's doubt, God's reassurance, the covenant ceremony, and the prophecy, which leads us to those 10 ites, and a deeper understanding of God's plan unfolding in history.
It's incredible how much depth and complexity is packed into just one chapter of the Bible.
What stands out to you as the most important takeaway from Genesis 15 so far?
I think it's the reminder that God keeps his promises, even when it seems impossible. Abraham faced incredible odds, old age, childlessness, powerful enemies in the land he was promised, but he chose to believe God, and that faith was credited to him as righteousness.
It's a challenge to us, isn't it, to trust in God's faithfulness even when we face setbacks or delays, to hold fast to his promises knowing that he is working all things together for our good.
Beautifully said, and I think it's also a reminder that God's plans unfold over time, often across generations. We may not see the immediate results of our faith, but we can trust that God is working in ways we can't always see.
So how can we apply these truths from Genesis 15 to our lives today? What practical steps can we take to cultivate that kind of unwavering faith?
That's a great question, and I think it's one we should explore further. But before we do, let's pause here and continue this conversation in our next episode. We'll delve deeper into the implications of righteousness by faith and how we can live out this truth in a world that often demands we rely on our own strength and understanding.
That's right, folks. Stay tuned for part 3 of our deep dive into Genesis 15, where we'll unpack these practical implications and consider what it means to be part of the relay race of faith, carrying the baton of God's promises into the future. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube at www.youtube.com at Radio WBCM, and join the conversation in the comments. We'll see you there.
Radio WBCM. Radio WBCM.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Genesis 15.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, from Abraham's doubt to the covenant ceremony to the prophecy, and even those 10 ites representing the complexities of God's plan unfolding in history.
And as we wrap up, I keep coming back to that central theme of righteousness by faith. It's such a foundational concept in Christianity, but it can also be a bit abstract. What does it actually mean to live out this truth in our everyday lives?
Well, it's a great question, and I think Genesis 15 offers us some practical insights. First, it reminds us that faith isn't about having all the answers or perfectly understanding how God is going to work things out. Abraham didn't have a detailed roadmap of how God would fulfill his promise. He simply chose to believe, even when it seemed impossible.
So it's about trusting God's character, his faithfulness, even when the circumstances seem to contradict his promises.
Exactly. It's about saying, God, I may not see the full picture, but I trust you. I believe you're good, you're powerful, and you're working all things together for my good.
That's a powerful shift in perspective. It's not about relying on our own understanding or trying to control the situation. It's about surrendering to God's wisdom and timing.
And that surrender is often where we struggle, isn't it? We want to figure things out, to have a plan, to be in control. But faith invites us to let go, to trust that God's ways are higher than our ways.
Yeah, it makes me think about the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They had the promised land in sight, but they still had to go through a period of testing and refinement.
That's a great parallel. The wilderness journey wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about shaping their character, teaching them to rely on God, preparing them for the challenges that lay ahead.
So righteousness by faith isn't just a one-time declaration. It's an ongoing process of trusting God, surrendering to his will, and allowing him to work in our lives. even when it's uncomfortable or
Yeah.
confusing.
And that process is often a communal one. Think about Abraham. He didn't receive the promise for himself alone. It was for his descendants, for generations to come. We're part of that lineage of faith.
Yeah, it's like we're all running a relay race, each generation passing the baton of faith to the next.
Exactly. We inherit the promises God made to Abraham, and we have a responsibility to carry them forward, to live them out, and to pass them on to those who come after us.
So it's not just about our individual relationship with God. It's about being part of something bigger, something that transcends time and space. It's about playing our part in God's grand redemptive story.
And that story is still being written today. We might not see the full picture, just like Abraham couldn't, but we can trust that God is working, that he's faithful to his promises, and that he invites us to participate in his amazing plan.
Genesis 15 really challenges us to think differently about faith, about God's timing, and about our place in his story. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's one thought you hope our listeners will take away with them?
Well, I hope they'll be encouraged to embrace the tension between the already and the not yet. We already have God's promises, his love, his grace, but the full realization of those promises is still unfolding. It's in that tension that faith thrives, that hope persists, and that we discover the beauty of trusting God, even when we don't have all the answers.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So as we go about our week, let's remember Abraham, a man who dared to believe even when it seemed impossible. And let's ask God to help us cultivate that same kind of unwavering faith, trusting that he is working all things together for our good and for his glory.
And if you're looking for more deep dives, discussions, and even Christian music reviews, be sure to check out our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/Radio WBCM. We release new content every week, so hit that subscribe button and join the conversation in the comments.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through Genesis 15. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you.